Hello, friends. It's good to be with you as always. Thanks for taking a little time to be with me today. I have in mind today, we're taping this on Monday, the 12th of October, and I have in mind today the sermon that Pastor Valerie Strand Patterson preached yesterday on Sunday, the 11th. Which lifted up a passage from Paul's letter to the Philippians, and we'll link to that sermon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen if you want to listen to it again. The words of Paul are famous words. You have probably heard them many times, and it's very simple. It's from chapter 4, verse 4, where Paul writes, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice." And Valerie pointed this out, but I will remind you that even though those sound like lovely, lighthearted, upbeat words, they were spoken when there was a lot of conflict going on in the world at the time. I'll lift up just three ways. There was conflict in the congregation at Philippi to whom Paul was writing, and this was a congregation he had started. He loved the people there, but clearly, when you read the rest of the letter, there were people in conflict around some issues in the congregation. That's sort of a micro level. At the macro level, there was a conflict between the Roman Empire and this new cult called Christianity, which Rome was opposed to and worried about. And so there was that sort of macro conflict. And then in Paul's own personal life, there was the conflict, if you want to call it that, of him being in prison. And not only in prison, but anticipating his own death, which is hinted at in this letter in a few places. This is the last, we think, of the letters that Paul wrote. So conflict in the congregation, conflict in the world, and conflict in Paul's own life. And yet, in that verse from Philippians, he admonishes and encourages the people of Philippi to rejoice. And he says it a second time, again, I will say rejoice. We know something about conflict in our time, of course. We've talked about this many times. 2020 has been in some ways a year filled with conflict. We have the pandemic, which is ongoing and seems to be maybe even spiking a bit. We have all kinds of conflict and issues around race in our country. And as if those two things aren't enough, we are in the midst of a highly polarized election cycle where our own nation is sort of in conflict, it seems, with ourselves. So we are familiar with conflict. I want to just remind us that we're not the first people to be familiar with conflict. Paul and the early Christians were as well, and for that matter, I would suggest everyone who's ever lived has known something about conflict. So today, very simply, I want to ask you the question, in the midst of the conflict we find ourselves in at this moment, and maybe you find yourselves in your own lives, is there something that you can rejoice about? And if you're willing, I would ask you simply to name that in the responses. If you're watching this on Facebook, you can indicate it there. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can add a response there. All it is a single word. One thing that on this particular day you can be grateful for and you can rejoice in. I will say for my part, this may seem like an obvious answer, but it's an honest answer. I rejoice at the congregation that we call St. Philip the Deacon. I rejoice at the work we are privileged and called to do on behalf of a God who loves us and who loves the world. And I give thanks for each and every one of you who are involved in the mission and ministry of this congregation. So again, the question for you, is there one way you can find to rejoice? And I will leave you again with Paul's words. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Thanks for spending some time with me. Be well, stay in touch, and God bless.